They say every man, deep down, holds a secret map to a better life, a treasure island of success paved with gold and glory. And most of us, we spend our lives squinting at that map, looking for the big, bold X that marks the spot. We hunt for the grand gesture, the sudden stroke of genius, the lucky break that will turn the whole damn thing around overnight. We stand there, holding our breath, waiting for the sky to open up and drop a miracle right into our laps. We believe that real change, real success, has to be loud, dramatic, a thunderclap in the quiet hum of existence. But sometimes the map ain't marked with an X at all. Sometimes it's just a faded dotted line, so faint you barely see it, leading you through a million tiny footsteps. And the real truth, the painful one nobody really wants to tell you, is that the thunderclap ain't coming. It's the rain. The steady, relentless, almost unnoticeable drip, drip, drip that fills the cistern, that carves the canyon, that brings the desert to bloom. It's not about being extraordinary in one blinding moment. It's about being ordinary relentlessly. It's about showing up day after day and doing that little bit. And what you don't realize, what you can't see until you're looking back from the other side, is that those average efforts, when stacked one on top of the other, they don't just add up. They multiply. They build something so solid, so undeniable, it makes all the big, flashy shortcuts look like sandcastles against a rising tide. There was a man who learned this truth the hard way, the only way a working man ever truly learns anything, through the grit and grind of his own two hands. His name was Frank. Frank at 45 wasn't just a number. It was a weight he carried, a shadow that stretched long behind him in the harsh, fluorescent lights of the factory floor. He wasn't a hero in any story you'd read in a book, just a man who punched a clock, ate his lunch out of a metal box, and went home to the same modest house he'd known for 2 decades. He worked at the Atlas Bearing Company, a place that smelled of hot metal, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, persistent tang of ambition dying slowly. You'd see him on the assembly line, a figure of quiet resilience, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone whose body knew the rhythm of the machines better than his own heartbeat. His uniform, perpetually stained with grease and fine metallic dust, hung on his broad shoulders like a second skin. He wasn't big or flashy, just solid, built like a brick wall that had seen a few storms but was still standing. His hands, Frank's hands, they told a story all their own. Knuckles swollen from years of gripping wrenches and hoisting parts, scarred from the occasional slip, nails perpetually rimmed with the indelible grime of industry. They were workers' hands, honest hands, but they also bore the subtle tremor of fatigue that had settled in deep, into the bone. You could see the strength there, the capability, but also the ache that had become a constant companion, like the background hum of the machinery. And his eyes, well, those were the windows to a man who had seen too much of the same thing. They were a dull, muted blue, often shadowed by the brim of his worn baseball cap, and they held a kind of weary wisdom. They observed everything, but rarely gave anything away. There was a quiet intensity behind them, a sense that he was always processing, always weighing, even when his face remained a placid, unreadable mask. They were the eyes of a man who'd learned to expect little, but still, somewhere deep down, hoped for more. Not for himself, not really anymore, but for the quiet, constant hum of the life he was trying to build for his family. He carried himself with a slight forward lean, a posture carved by years of leaning over machines, of lifting and pushing. It wasn't weakness. It was the quiet resilience of a man who had put in countless hours of physical labor, and whose very bearing suggested a profound, if unspoken, dependability. His hair, once a deeper brown, was now a salt and pepper mix, thinning a bit at the crown, a testament to the passage of time and the slow, inexorable march of gravity. There was a faint, worry line etched permanently between his eyebrows, a testament to the quiet battles fought within, battles over bills and futures and what might have been. He was the kind of man you'd trust with a secret or with your last dollar, knowing he'd hold onto both with equal tenacity. A bit gruff, maybe, if you caught him before his first cup of coffee, but fair. Always fair. He was frank, and his life, for all its quiet dignity, felt stuck. Like a gear perpetually grinding, spinning in place, never quite catching to move the whole machine forward. He felt the weight of it, the constant effort, the average results. And he often wondered what was the secret. What was he missing? There was a man, a good man, who worked hard every day of his life, pushed his body, quieted his mind, and still he watched the world turn, waiting for something to catch. He wasn't lazy. Never was. He wasn't afraid of an honest day's work. But he was stuck, And in that quiet stuckness, in the constant grind of average efforts yielding average returns, he felt a kinship with every working soul who ever looked at the horizon and wondered if there was something more, something different, waiting just beyond the sweat and the struggle. He often thought about the big shot, the one who found the secret, the one who broke free. But that wasn't him. That wasn't Frank. Frank's day began, as it always had, with the shrill insistency of an alarm clock at 5 a.m. Not a gentle chime, but a harsh, mechanical demand that ripped him from the shallow waters of sleep. The air in the small bedroom was always a little cooler than the rest of the house, a faint chill that seemed to seep into his bones as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. Maria, his wife, stirred beside him, a soft sigh escaping her lips, then settled back into sleep. He moved quietly, a practiced ghost in the pre-dawn darkness, navigating the familiar landscape of their modest, slightly worn-out single-story house in an older working-class suburb. The smell of stale coffee from yesterday, faintly lingering, and the promise of a fresh, strong brew filled the kitchen as he got to work. He'd make Lena's lunch first. His daughter, 16, still needed her dad to pack her a decent meal. Then his own thermos, black as night, strong as an ox. The drive to the factory was a blur of sleepy streetlights and the drone of the old pickup truck's engine. He knew every pothole, every turn, every minute delay. Once inside the sprawling, concrete behemoth, the world shifted from quiet expectation to a symphony of industrial clamor. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal, the hiss of hydraulic presses, the whine of conveyor belts, it was the soundtrack to his life. 8 hours, sometimes 10, of repetitive motion. Lifting parts, inspecting welds, tightening bolts. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with an almost unconscious precision, performing tasks he could do in his sleep, and sometimes he felt like he was. The days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each one a carbon copy of the last. The work wasn't hard in a mind-bending way, but it was relentless, physically demanding, and utterly monotonous. It paid the bills, mostly. It put food on the table. It kept the lights on. But it never seemed to do more than that. Every month the bills arrived, a predictable parade of envelopes demanding their due. Mortgage, utilities, car insurance, Lena's school fees, groceries that seemed to get pricier by the week. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, a cheap pen in his rough hand, meticulously adding columns of numbers, trying to stretch every dollar. Maria often joined him, her brow furrowed with the same quiet worry. They'd talk in hushed tones, strategizing, cutting, sacrificing. Another movie night out pushed off. That small repair for the truck postponed. A new dress for Lena, just for a moment considered, then regretfully crossed off the list. The gap between what they needed and what they had never seemed to close. It was a constant tightrope walk, and sometimes Frank felt like a failure, not because he didn't work hard, but because the hard work never seemed to get them ahead. Just kept them from falling too far behind. Beneath that quiet resilience, deeper than the worry lines etched on his face, lay a current of frustration. He wasn't just tired in his body, he was tired in his soul. He harbored buried dreams, fragments of a younger man's ambitions. Maybe a small business of his own, maybe a different kind of work that used his head as much as his hands, maybe just a life where comfortable wasn't a whispered prayer but an actual state of being. He remembered trying once, years ago, to learn some basic coding online, convinced that was the future. He'd thrown himself into it for a month, staying up late, driven by a fierce, unfamiliar excitement. But when the immediate breakthroughs didn't materialize, when the complex concepts felt like slogging through mud, he'd quit. Just like he'd quit that intense workout routine after 6 weeks when his belly still wasn't flat and his arms weren't bulging. He'd tried a side hustle selling some widgets online, hustling hard for a few weeks, putting in extra hours after the factory, only to see meager returns and give up, convinced it was just another dead end. Each abandoned effort left a bitter residue of self-doubt. He'd watch other men, sometimes younger, sometimes less outwardly driven, seem to catch their stride, climb the ladder, or launch something successful. He'd see them drive nicer cars, take their families on real vacations, and a cold envy would prick at him. What was their magic? What was the secret ingredient he was missing? He worked just as hard, sometimes harder. He put in the effort. But his efforts, he'd concluded, were just average, inconsequential. He longed for the grand gesture, the big break, the dramatic shift that would transform everything overnight. And because that never came, because life felt like an endless series of small, unheroic days, he remained quietly, stubbornly, tragically stuck. The man who could fix anything with his hands couldn't fix the quiet despair in his heart. He struggled to articulate these inner battles, letting them fester, creating a perceived stoicism that made him seem unapproachable, even to those who loved him most. The truth was, he just didn't know how to say what was wrong, or more importantly, how to make it right. Every morning, the same silent ritual unfolded in the pre-dawn dark of the house on Hemlock Street. The alarm clock, an old digital relic with glowing green numbers, would shriek at 5:00 a.m., a sound Frank had grown to resent with the same quiet intensity he reserved for tax forms and flat tires. He'd slap it into submission, swing his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar ache in his lower back a grumpy greeting, and sit there for a full minute, head in hands, listening to the house breathe around him. Maria was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Lena, his daughter, tucked away in her room down the hall, likely dreaming teenage dreams far removed from the clang of steel and the smell of grease. He'd shuffle to the kitchen, the worn linoleum cool beneath his calloused feet. The coffee pot would already be set up, Maria's silent act of love and foresight, and he'd hit the switch, watching the dark liquid gurgle and steam. While it brewed, he'd toast 2 slices of white bread, spread a thin layer of margarine, and eat them standing by the window, staring out at the identical rows of modest houses, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. It was the quietest part of his day, often the only time he felt truly alone with his thoughts, for better or worse. Most days it was for worse. By 5:45 a.m., he was in his beat-up Ford F-150, the same model he'd driven for 15 years, the same exact route he'd taken for 25. The factory, a sprawling brick beast that belched steam into the morning sky, would loom larger with every mile. He knew every pothole on every road leading there, every turn, every cracked curb. He knew the faces of the other early birds, hunched over their steering wheels in their own procession of tired steel, all heading to their own posts in the machinery of the city. Inside the factory, time didn't flow, it just piled up. Hours spent on the assembly line, his hands moving with the practiced, almost unconscious rhythm of a craftsman, but a craftsman without joy. He'd fasten bolts, weld seams, lift heavy components, his body protesting in a symphony of clicks and groans. The air was thick with the metallic tang of molten steel, the whine of grinders, the ceaseless thrum of powerful machines. It was honest work, demanding work that paid the bills, but it offered little else. No spark, no challenge, just the steady, relentless march of the clock, marking off another day, another week, another month, another year. The money, while steady, was a perpetual tightrope walk. Every paycheck felt like it evaporated before it even hit the bank. Mortgage, utilities, car insurance, groceries, Lena's school supplies, her phone bill, the occasional doctor's visit. He and Maria played a constant game of financial whack-a-mole, patching one hole only for another to spring open. They hadn't taken a real vacation in years, not the kind where you saw an ocean or a mountain range. Their idea of a getaway was a Saturday afternoon drive to the next town over, maybe a cheap lunch. Lena, God bless her, never complained, but he saw the longing in her eyes when her friends talked about their trips to amusement parks or their new gadgets. It was a dull, constant ache in his chest, the feeling of not being able to give them more. This was his world, a cycle of waking, working, worrying, and falling into bed, only to rise and repeat. But beneath the stoic exterior, the quiet observance, and the gruff dependability, something else churned. Buried deep under layers of factory dust and fatigue were the fragments of a different life he'd once envisioned. When he was Lena's age, he'd dreamt of opening his own auto repair shop, not just fixing cars, but restoring them, breathing new life into old machines. He'd imagined himself being his own boss, setting his own hours, building something from scratch with his own 2 hands, something that bore his name, his mark of quality. That young man, full of spit and vinegar and wild ambitions, felt like a stranger now, a ghost from a past life. He looked in the mirror some mornings and barely recognized the tired eyes staring back, the lines etched deep around them, the shoulders that slumped just a little more each year. The gap between that hopeful kid and the worn-out factory worker felt like an unbridgeable chasm. He hadn't failed spectacularly, no, that wasn't Frank's way. He'd failed quietly, incrementally, by letting his dreams fade into the background noise of responsibility and perceived limitations. He yearned for a better life for Maria and Lena, a life where they weren't constantly scraping by, where Lena could have opportunities he never did. But how? He was 45. Too old, he told himself, too set in his ways, too worn down. The self-doubt was a constant hum in his mind, a low-frequency vibration that rattled his confidence. He'd convinced himself that he was just average, that his efforts, no matter how hard, would always yield average results. And because he believed that, he kept looking for the lightning bolt, the magic pill, the shortcut that would bypass all the average stuff. He struggled to articulate these inner battles, letting them fester, creating a perceived stoicism that made him seem unapproachable, even to those who loved him most. The truth was, he just didn't know how to say what was wrong, or more importantly, how to make it right. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, its bars forged from cynicism and the bitter taste of abandoned efforts. It started as most big changes do, not with a bang, but with a whimper. A D- on Lena's math report card. Frank found it crumpled on the kitchen table, underneath a stack of school flyers, a tiny, devastating flag of surrender. Maria was already there, her hand resting on Lena's shoulder, trying to soothe the quiet sobs. Lena, 16, usually so bright, her confidence in everything else unshakable, now sat slumped, defeated. We could try a tutor," Maria suggested, her voice thin, almost a question. They both knew it was out of reach. Expensive. Another bill they couldn't just conjure money for. Frank just clenched his jaw, that familiar knot of frustration tightening in his gut. He hated feeling helpless, hated seeing that look in Lena's eyes, a mirrored reflection of his own buried disappointments. What could he do? He wasn't a math whiz. His own schooling hadn't exactly been illustrious. He'd barely scraped by himself, relying on brute force memorization rather than true understanding. The self-doubt hummed louder. His average efforts, what good would they be? But then he looked at Lena again, at the tear tracks on her cheeks, and something shifted. A stubborn refusal to let her feel that defeated. "No tutor," he said, his voice gruff, though inside he felt a tremor of uncertainty. We'll figure it out." Maria looked at him, surprise mingling with a flicker of hope. Frank barely registered it. He was already thinking, not a grand plan, not an overnight miracle, just something. "All right," he announced that evening, clearing his throat. Lena looked up wary. 15 minutes every night. "We'll go over whatever you struggled with." Lena's brow furrowed. "Just 15 minutes, she asked, skepticism clear in her voice. Frank nodded. He felt it too, that doubt. What could 15 minutes possibly accomplish against a D- and months of confusion? It felt insignificant, too small, too average, but it was all he had, all they could manage. So it began, awkwardly at first. Lena, still embarrassed, would drag her feet. Frank, tired from the factory, would sometimes just stare blankly at the page, trying to remember how to simplify fractions. They weren't solving complex equations. They were going back to basics, ratios, percentages, the building blocks. Sometimes Lena would get frustrated and lash out. Sometimes Frank would feel the old impatience flare, wanting to just get it done, to see results, to feel like his effort was worth something. But he remembered Lena's tear-stained face, and he would take a deep breath, and they would push through. 15 minutes, no more, no less, rain or shine, after dinner, before the late news, the kitchen table light a consistent beacon. For weeks it felt like nothing, like bailing water with a sieve. Lena would get one concept, forget it the next day. Frank would feel that familiar cynicism creeping back. See, he'd tell himself, just average, no magic here. But then after about a month, something almost imperceptible shifted. A tiny spark of recognition in Lena's eyes. A question she asked that showed she was actually thinking about the problem, not just guessing. Then a test score came back, not a D-, but a C, a tiny victory. Not extraordinary by any means, but it was progress, and they kept going, 15 minutes, every night. The quiet rhythm of it became a part of their lives. Frank watched Lena's shoulders relax a little, her explanations become clearer. He saw her confidence, like a slow-blooming flower, begin to unfurl. 3 months, that's how long it took. When Lena brought home her next report card, it was a B+. Not an A, not a scholarship to Harvard, but a B+. Her eyes, usually so guarded when it came to math, were shining with a quiet, fierce pride. And Frank felt something he hadn't felt in years. A warmth that spread through his chest, pushing back the cold cynicism he'd worn like a second skin. It wasn't the big break he'd always sought. It was a consistent, small effort, compounding into something real, something profound. He saw it in Lena's eyes, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. What if? That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The house was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. He lay on his back, staring up at the darkened ceiling, the clock on his nightstand glowing a soft, unforgiving red. 3:17 a.m. Lena's B+ wasn't just a grade, it was a mirror. It reflected back not just her effort, but his own, the small, consistent pushes he'd made, and the results that had silently, almost miraculously, accumulated. And then it slammed into him, the brutal honesty he'd managed to avoid for so long. What had his life become? He had spent years chasing the elusive big break, the secret shortcut that would bypass the grind. He tried to get fit intensely for a month, then given up when he didn't see a six-pack immediately. He pursued a side hustle, thrown himself into it aggressively for a few weeks, only to quit when the immediate flood of cash wasn't there. He'd always pushed hard, then pulled back, convinced that his average efforts were just that average, inconsequential, not worth the continued struggle. He rolled onto his side, punching his pillow, the soft thud absorbed by the silence. All those abandoned efforts, all those half-baked plans. He'd convinced himself he was too old, too tired, too set in his ways. But Lena, his 16-year-old daughter, had just shown him the lie he'd been living. 15 minutes a day. Just 15 minutes consistently applied had transformed a D- into a B+. It wasn't about being brilliant, it was about showing up, day after day, when he didn't feel like it. When the results were imperceptible, a cold wave of shame washed over him. All those wasted years, wasted effort, wasted potential. He thought about Maria, always trying to stretch every dollar her tired smile. He thought about the bills, the constant tightrope walk. He thought about the quiet dreams he'd buried, the man he thought he could have been, the life he wanted for his family. He'd been so focused on the finish line, on the extraordinary leap, that he'd ignored the power of 1,000 tiny steps. He was exhausted and frustrated, not because he wasn't trying, but because he was trying wrong. He'd always expected immediate fireworks, and when he only saw a flicker, he'd extinguished the flame himself. The silence of the house pressed in on him. This wasn't just about Lena's math anymore. This was about him, his life, his future. If a small, consistent effort could move Lena from a D to a B+, what could it do for him? What if average effort wasn't the problem, but the inconsistency of it? The thought was both terrifying and liberating. It was like finally seeing the key to a cage he'd been rattling for decades, a key he'd always dismissed as too small to matter. The silence of the house pressed in on him. This wasn't just about Lena's math anymore. This was about him, his life, his future. If a small, consistent effort could move Lena from a D to a B+, what could it do for him? What if average effort wasn't the problem, but the inconsistency of it? The thought was both terrifying and liberating. It was like finally seeing the key to a cage he'd been rattling for decades, a key he'd always dismissed as too small to matter. He sat there long after Maria and Lena were asleep, the only sound the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sigh of traffic. His hands, usually busy, were still on his knees. He traced the calluses with a thumb, feeling the worn landscape of his life. Every ache, every disappointment, every half-hearted attempt at something better flashed through his mind. The gym memberships bought with good intentions and abandoned after 6 weeks. The online courses started with a burst of enthusiasm, then gathering digital dust. The savings accounts that never quite took off. It wasn't a lack of trying, he realized with a jolt that went right through him. It was a lack of staying. He hadn't just given up on the activities, he'd given up on the idea that small, unnoticed effort could ever amount to anything. He'd scoffed at it. A deep breath expanded his chest, tasting faintly of stale coffee and something else. Something like old regret mixed with a strange, burgeoning clarity. He couldn't keep going like this. This treadmill of hope and immediate disappointment. This cycle of exhaustion and frustration. It wasn't fair to Maria, always patching things together. It wasn't fair to Lena, who deserved a father who showed her more than just physical strength. It certainly wasn't fair to the man he knew, deep down, he still had a shot at being. It wasn't an angry declaration. There was no slamming of fists or shouting into the empty living room. It was a quiet settling, a resolve hardening in his gut. Enough, just enough. He didn't know what exactly he was going to do or how or if it would even work. He just knew the old way was done. Kaput. No more. The next morning, the alarm blared at 4:30 a.m. Frank usually slapped it quiet, grunted, and dragged himself out of bed 40 minutes later for a quick shower before hitting the factory floor. But today was different. Today, the enough still echoed in his bones. He lay there for a long minute, the darkness pressing in, the warmth of the bed calling him back. His brain, well trained in the art of self-sabotage, immediately started listing excuses. Too tired. It's too cold out. Just one more day, what difference will it make? You'll feel stupid out there by yourself. He pushed Maria's sleeping arm a fraction, careful not to wake her. Her soft, even breathing was a comfort, but also a challenge. He thought of Lena, her excited face when she showed him that B+. He remembered the sheer, undeniable proof of what those tiny, consistent 15 minutes had done. Average effort. He repeated it in his head, a mantra against the inertia. Average effort consistently applied. Legs felt heavy like lead pipes as he swung them out from under the covers. The cold floor bit at his bare feet a sharp jolt. He fumbled in the closet for his worn-out sneakers and a faded hoodie. He didn't bother with coffee. The thought of it settling in his stomach while walking felt wrong. He walked into the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and filled a glass with cold tap water. He drank it slowly, the chill a further wake-up call. Then he opened the front door. The pre-dawn air hit him, damp and brisk, smelling of wet asphalt and distant exhaust. It was still dark, the streetlights casting long, weak shadows. Not a soul stirred. He took a hesitant step out onto the porch. Then another, and another. He wasn't thinking about a 5-mile run or getting ripped or anything grand. He was thinking just 20 minutes, one foot in front of the other, like Lena's math, just show up. His first few steps down the sidewalk were stiff, his muscles protesting. He felt a dull ache in his knees, a tightness in his back. He wanted to turn around, crawl back into the warm bed, pretend this foolishness never happened. But he didn't. He walked past Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rose bushes, still sleeping under their winter covers. He passed the corner market, its neon sign a ghostly glow in the gloom. He didn't walk fast. He just walked, one foot, then the other. 20 minutes. He didn't even enjoy it. It was cold. It was hard. But he did it. And when he turned back towards his house, the first faint blush of orange staining the eastern sky, a tiny, unfamiliar spark ignited inside him. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the undeniable truth of a promise kept to himself. The next morning, the spark felt more like a dying ember, barely clinging to life. The alarm shrieked, a metallic summons, and Frank's hand instinctively reached to silence it, then lingered over the snooze button. The bed was a warm, soft embrace, the pillow a silent lullaby promising escape from the chill. 20 minutes. Just 20 minutes, the thought was a brittle whisper against the booming voice of his overwhelming fatigue. He dragged himself out, each protest from his body a personal betrayal. The cold bite of the floorboards was a familiar shock now, but no less unwelcome. Each step felt heavier than the last, his legs stiff as old timber, his back a familiar knot of chronic aches. He walked. It wasn't enjoyable. It was a chore, a penance he was inflicting upon himself. Day 3 came, and with it a new, insidious layer of mental resistance. His body felt no different, perhaps even more tired, more prone to nagging twinges than before. The early morning walk was no longer a nascent, curious experiment. It was a commitment, and commitments, he knew from long experience, often felt like shackles tightening around his spirit. He saw no change in his ragged breath. No loosening in his perpetually tight muscles, certainly no sudden burst of revitalizing energy. What's the use, Frank? Just another one of your bright ideas that goes nowhere, same as all the rest. The old voice, his cynical companion from 1,000 abandoned projects, was back with a vengeance, whispering familiar, corrosive doubts. He looked at his reflection in the steamed-up bathroom mirror, a man whose face still carried the deep-set lines of the factory, whose stomach still protruded stubbornly despite his daily efforts. Average effort for average results. Always been that way. Always will be. He almost didn't go. But then, a flash. Lena's hopeful, earnest face bent over her math book, solving that tricky algebra problem they'd drilled for the 15th time. He pictured her small, triumphant smile, the way her eyes would light up with understanding. He swallowed hard, the bitterness of his own self-doubt momentarily eclipsed. Just show up. Just like Lena. A full week crawled by, each morning a carbon copy of the last in its struggle. 7 mornings of dragging himself out of bed before the world woke, of the same stiff legs and the same biting, unforgiving air. 7 mornings of watching the sun rise, feeling nothing but a profound, frustrating sense of ordinariness, an absence of the dramatic change he'd always craved. Maria, stirring sleepily when he returned, her eyes still heavy with sleep, finally voiced the question he'd been dreading. "Still at it, Frank? What's the point? You look just as tired, if not more." Her words meant with a weary sort of kindness, twisted like a knife in his gut. He just grunted, a noncommittal sound, showered quickly and headed for the factory, the familiar, comforting smell of grease and metal a welcome monotony compared to the relentless, unseen battle he was fighting within himself. He hadn't lost an ounce. He hadn't felt a surge of vitality. He was just walking. He felt like a fool engaged in a pointless ritual. He was doing the average thing, and he was getting what he perceived as average results, which meant, in his old way of thinking, no results at all. He was waiting for the big payoff, the sudden, undeniable shift, the visible proof that his effort wasn't being utterly wasted. And it simply wasn't coming. There was a Tuesday deep into the second week of this new, unwelcome discipline when the alarm went off at 5 a.m. and Frank simply hit snooze. Once. The second time, he pressed it again, more forcefully. The third time, he muted it entirely, plunging the room back into silent darkness. He burrowed deeper into the covers, pulling them up to his chin, the warmth and soft oblivion a powerful narcotic. Just today, he rationalized, a voice slick with temptation. I'm exhausted. I deserve a break. One day won't matter in the grand scheme of things. Nobody will even know. He closed his eyes, drifting back towards the sweet promise of sleep, feeling the delicious, illicit relief wash over him. Then a sharp, unbidden image flashed in his mind, cutting through the haze. Lena slumped over her complicated homework, her brow furrowed in deep frustration, a single tear tracing a path down her flushed cheek. That helpless, defeated look in her eyes, the very look that had broken something loose in him just a few months prior. He remembered the quiet, almost solemn determination with which they'd tackled fractions, then decimals, then algebraic equations. 15 minutes, every single night. No grand gestures, no expensive tutors, just the quiet, persistent grind chipping away at ignorance. He remembered her B+ on the last math test, not a miracle, but a steady, earned victory brick by brick. His eyes snapped open, wide and staring into the darkness. The room was still utterly black, but it no longer felt welcoming. The air felt heavy, suffocating with his own self-pity and near capitulation. He threw the covers back with a sudden, violent motion, the abrupt chill of the room a jolt that cleared his head. No, not today, not ever again. He didn't feel like it. He didn't want to. Every protesting cell in his body screamed for more sleep, for ease, for the familiar, comfortable path of giving up when immediate, dramatic results weren't delivered on a silver platter. But the memory of Lena's small, consistent efforts and the monumental, life-changing outcome was a new kind of fuel, a quiet inferno burning in his gut. It wasn't about feeling good in the moment or seeing instant, miraculous change. It was about showing up. It was about honoring that quiet promise, not to himself in a fleeting moment of resolve, but to that profound idea, that undeniable truth he'd seen manifest so clearly in his daughter. He pulled on his worn track pants and a faded, shapeless sweatshirt, his movements stiff, deliberate, and entirely devoid of joy. He didn't hesitate at the front door this time, didn't even pause. He just opened it and stepped out into the pre-dawn quiet, one foot in front of the other. It wasn't a triumphant stride. It wasn't a triumphant stride, not in the heroic sense, but it was a step. Then another, and another. Day after day, that 5 a.m. alarm kept screaming, and Frank kept dragging himself out of bed. The first week, every morning was a battle against the pillow, a wrestling match with his own inertia. He'd walk those 20 minutes, the chill air biting, his joints protesting, then settle down for 30 minutes of staring at the computer screen, trying to make sense of the online course on basic mechanics. His brain felt like a rusty gear, grinding against new information. He still doubted, still questioned the point. What was a measly 20 minutes of walking against decades of factory grime? What good would 30 minutes of online learning do when there were real engineers with fancy degrees? But he kept showing up. Maria, bless her heart, started to notice. She'd wake to the faint sound of his movements, not his usual heavy sighs, and sometimes, if she was up early for Lena, she'd see him coming back, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow, his breath pluming in the cold air. She didn't say much, just brewed an extra cup of coffee. Lena, wrapped in her own teenage world, occasionally caught him hunched over the kitchen table, not with a beer, but with his nose practically touching the monitor, the faint blue light illuminating his concentration. He wasn't a scholar, never had been, but he was trying. Around the third week, something peculiar started to happen. The internal resistance didn't vanish, not entirely, but it softened. The thought of the walk still felt like a chore, but his body, surprisingly, craved the rhythm. His breath deepened, his legs moved with less protest. The online lessons, once a blurry stream of jargon, began to click into place, small pieces of a puzzle slotting together. He started to recognize terms, understand concepts. He even found himself muttering about torque specifications or hydraulic pressure when he was working on a tricky machine at the factory, much to the amusement of old George on the line. "What's gotten into you, Frank?" George chuckled one afternoon, wiping grease from his hands. "Soundin' like you're ready to open your own shop." Frank just grunted, a familiar response, but this time a tiny, almost imperceptible pride flickered in his eyes. He didn't elaborate, wouldn't know how to explain it. He didn't feel like a genius, not by a long shot. He just felt less lost. The frustration of not understanding was slowly being replaced by the quiet satisfaction of gradual comprehension. The small, fixed amount he put into savings each payday, once a gesture of futility, now represented a tiny, growing bulwark against the constant tide of bills. It wasn't much, but it was there. It was his. A couple of months later, the change was undeniable, even to Frank himself. His shoulders, usually hunched from years of heavy lifting and heavier worries, seemed a little straighter. His eyes, though still holding the quiet resilience of a working man, had a new, steady light in them, less tired, more alert. He'd lost a few pounds, his worn uniform fitting a bit looser, a testament to the cumulative effect of those daily walks. He wasn't running marathons, but he could walk for an hour without feeling completely winded. He felt lighter, not just physically, but mentally. The constant hum of anxiety that used to be his baseline had receded, replaced by a low thrum of quiet purpose. At the factory, he became the unexpected go-to guy for minor machine troubles. His online course, initially chosen almost at random, had given him a basic theoretical framework he could apply. He wasn't fixing major breakdowns, but he could diagnose a strange knocking sound or suggest a simple adjustment that saved time, saved a call to the external tech. His coworkers, initially skeptical, started to nod their approval. "Frank's got a knack," they'd say. He'd just shrug, but inside a quiet warmth spread. He was useful in a new way beyond just his strong back. At home, the shift was profound. He still wasn't a chatterbox, but the silence at the dinner table was less heavy. He'd actually listen when Lena talked about school, offering thoughtful, if brief, advice. Maria, seeing him more engaged, more present, started to relax. The tension that had often gripped their small home began to dissipate. One evening, looking at their savings account balance online, seeing the slow, steady climb, a genuine, unforced smile touched his lips. It wasn't enough to buy a fancy car or a new house, but it was enough to cover an unexpected repair, enough to breathe a little easier, enough to dream a little. He still didn't have all the answers. The world was still a tough place, and life still threw punches. But Frank wasn't just reacting anymore. He was building. He was shaping. He realized that the average efforts he'd once dismissed as insignificant weren't failures. They were simply foundations. He hadn't been looking for the big secret anymore because he'd found it not in some guru's book, but in the relentless ticking of his own alarm clock and the steady, unwavering beat of his own feet on the pavement. He didn't need a grand revelation every morning. The revelation was already there, hidden in the slow drag of the coffee pot, the familiar squeak of his work boots, the quiet click of his keyboard as he watched another video lesson. He wasn't trying to become a rocket scientist, just someone who understood a little more about the electrical systems in the factory, something that had always felt like black magic to him. 30 minutes every single day after Lena was in bed. It wasn't always thrilling. Sometimes he felt his eyelids droop, sometimes his brain felt like a bogged-down engine. But he showed up. He pressed play. He took a few notes. Then came the day the new PLC controller went haywire on line 3. Panic spread through the floor. The regular maintenance crew was stumped, waiting on an outside specialist who was hours away. Production was bleeding money by the minute. Frank, almost without thinking, walked up to the blinking, complaining machine. He'd watched a video about this specific model just 2 nights before. He saw a diagnostic code flash that looked familiar, reached for a panel, found a loose connection he'd learned to identify. A quiet click, a restart, and the line hummed back to life. The supervisor, a man who usually only grunted Frank's way, clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to sting. "Frank, what the hell? How'd you know that?" Frank just shrugged, the old gruffness still a habit, but a small smile played at the corner of his lips. "Just saw it in a video, boss." It wasn't a miracle. It was 30 minutes compounded over weeks and months. It was average effort adding up. His legs, too, felt different. Those 20-minute walks had turned into a steady, rhythmic hour. His old work pants felt looser, his breath came easier, and the constant ache in his lower back was now just a distant memory. Maria, one Sunday morning, watched him effortlessly carry a heavy bag of topsoil from the car to the garden. She shook her head, a soft, admiring smile on her face. "You're not getting younger, Frank, but you're getting stronger." He just grunted, but his chest swelled a little with pride. One evening after dinner, Lena approached him, a tentative smile on her face. "Dad, my English teacher said I have to choose a topic for a big research paper. I was thinking about how small things can make a big difference." Frank looked at her, his daughter, who now tackled her homework with a quiet confidence that mirrored his own. Her D in math was a faded memory. "That's a good topic, Lena," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it in years. "A real good topic." He didn't need to elaborate. She understood. They both did. He thought about his old self, the one who'd look for the big secret, the magic bullet. He'd tried crash diets, get-rich-quick schemes, sudden bursts of ambition that fizzled out like damp fireworks. He saw it now clear as day. The painful truth about success wasn't that it was impossible. It was that it was incredibly boring at first. It wasn't about being brilliant. It was about being dependable. It wasn't about sudden leaps. It was about relentless, tiny steps. "See, Lena," he started, the words coming easier, now rough but true. "People always look for the big secret, the overnight success. Truth is, there ain't one. It's just showing up day after day, doing that little bit. Don't gotta be a hero, just gotta be there. Those small efforts, they don't look like much on their own. But you stack 'em up one on top of the other, and after a while you look back and realize you built something you never thought you could. Something real. It's like compound interest, but for your life." He wasn't a rich man, not by the world's measure. But his family was secure, his mind was sharper, his body stronger. He had peace.